say you'll catch me.
Hey guys, Jazz back with another video. In this video, we're going to rank every single NFC team, basically playoff dominance over the last 20 years. Basically, I've been a really huge football fan for the last 20 years. So I want to go back and look at each team's playoff resume in the NFC, and I'll probably do another video of the AFC if you guys want me to. Again, comment down below if you guys want to see it. Leave a like. You know what you guys got to do. But what I want to do is rank every single team and just their playoff success over the last 2 decades. That's basically my whole football fandom, and that brings me back to look at teams and examine, oh my god, like this team has actually been better than I thought over the last 2 decades, or this team has been a lot worse. There were like 2 big surprises that I found out of doing this list that I just didn't think one team was that bad, and I didn't think one team was that good to being almost close to being the best team in the NFC over that time period. So again, these are interesting lists to do when I go and look up all these stats. So basically what I'm going to weigh are playoff appearances, playoff wins, certain things I weigh higher. Like a lot of playoff appearances that actually gets weighed good. Like even if you're losing, making it to the playoffs is an accomplishment. And then it's also getting wins when you're in the playoffs. Getting wins is important as well. And then like if you make it to the Super Bowl, that's an accomplishment as well, because you're not just racking up on like wild card wins or divisional playoff wins. You're actually winning NFC title games and stuff like that. So a run to the Super Bowl is kind of weighed a little bit higher than other things. And also actually winning a Super Bowl carries a lot of weight. So winning a Super Bowl carries a lot of weight in your playoff success over the last 2 decades. So obviously teams that won Super Bowls are going to be higher on the list, just because even if they didn't have a lot of playoff success other than those Super Bowl runs, you still have to put them up there because they got the ring. At the end of the day, all the teams play for is getting a championship. If you don't have a championship, it doesn't mean anything. So but again, I'm going to rank them, and that's how I'm ranking them. Playoff appearances have weight. Even if you lost all of them, if you have a ton of playoff appearances, it's still, you're at least making it to the playoffs a lot. So everything is weighed, including playoff appearances, wins in the playoffs, Super Bowl runs, and then Super Bowl wins. So that's how I'm rated. I don't want to get too much of the talking, and hopefully you guys get the gist of it. I'm going to basically just rank each team, and I'm going to show like basically their playoff record and their Super Bowl records. And basically if they have a Super Bowl win, obviously that's a playoff appearance that they didn't take an L. So I'll add that to, you know, the losses is basically all their playoff appearances plus Super Bowl wins will total up your playoff appearances for you guys who get confused on all the playoff appearances. And it's pretty simple. I'm just going to put their records, what they've done in the last 20 years. Basically, I've been a football fan for the last 20 years. So that's why I wanted to go back the last 20 years and see how every team ranked in the last 20 years. So that's pretty much it. We're going to get into it with number 16. All right, guys, we're starting with the Detroit Lions. Basically, how I'm going to do it, on one side is going to show, I believe on the bottom left, if you're watching it, is going to show their playoff record, which is 0-4, and their Super Bowl record, which is 0-0. Obviously, they don't have any playoff wins, so they don't have any Super Bowl runs. So I hope that you guys don't take it personally. I'm just ranking them basically just purely off their playoff stats. I'm not going off of anything else. Basically, appearances, wins, all these stuff are weighed together to come out with a prediction. And this is one of the teams that's worse than I thought, because obviously I know the Lions have been bad and they haven't won a Super Bowl, but since they've been good recently, like ever since Matt Stafford's been there, they've been playing a lot better. I forget how bad they've been. Kind of, you know, it kind of threw me, like took me away from that. They've been really bad, and they only have 4 playoff appearances, which is tied for last. They have 0 playoff wins, which is the worst in the NFL. No other team has less playoff. No NFC team has less playoff wins. There are some pretty bad AFC teams as well. We could get into that one on a different one, but they have the least amount of wins, and they're tied for the least amount of playoff appearances. They speak for themselves. They have been the worst team in the NFC over the last 2 decades. At number 15, we have the Washington Redskins. I don't ever recall having a good Washington Redskins team. I know they had Santana Moss and all those days. I mean, they've never really been good in my lifetime as a football fan. Obviously, I go back to, like, I started watching football like in late 90s, so they've never actually been a good team. I know early 90s and stuff, they had some good teams, but in my lifetime as a football fan, they've never actually been a good team. And they had the, you know, the Robert RG3 year, whatever. They had a good run. He hurt his knee in that playoff game, and basically they've never been the same since. They just haven't been a good team. They're tied for the second least amount of playoff wins over the last 2 decades. They've been to the playoffs only 5 times, which is one of the worst. So, like I said, they are the 15th worst NFC team over the last 2 decades. At number 14, we have the Bears. And the Bears have been pretty bad. I recall them being very bad in my lifetime. I don't ever really see them being that good. They had that one lucky playoff run, which you see they're 0-1 in Super Bowls. They're 3-4. They had that one playoff run with Kyle Orton and Rex Grossman. That is the highlight of their last 20 years. Rex Grossman and Kyle Orton. Yeah, let that sink in. So they've been pretty bad. If you take out that Super Bowl run, they're just as bad or worse than the Detroit Lions. And they actually both play in the same division, which is pretty bad. Those two teams have been pretty bad over the last 2 decades. They got in the NFC North, they have 2 of the worst teams over the past 20 years, which is crazy. But yeah, they've been very terrible. They haven't really done anything. They have the one playoff run, like I said. They deserve it. They have they're tied for least amount of playoff appearances. So the Bears, even though they had that one Super Bowl run, I'm sorry, I just hit the mic. They had that one Super Bowl run. They have been really bad over the last 2 decades, only making the playoffs 4 times, having only 3 wins. So have to put the Bears at number 14 over the past 2 decades in the NFC. At number 13, we have America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. And I know all the Cowboys fans are going to go crazy in the comment section, but yes, your playoff resume over the last 2 decades is pitiful, downright pitiful. They only have 2 wins in the last 2 decades in the playoffs. They are 0-0 in the Super Bowl because they have no Super Bowl wins. And I told you guys that I will weigh Super Bowl runs more than, regular playoff appearances. But since the Cowboys had 8 playoff appearances to the Bears 4, kind of weighed that a little bit more than their one Super Bowl run where they pretty much, Kyle or Rex Grossman. Yeah, yikes. So yeah, that's why I put them ahead of them. There's going to be a few teams here that you maybe could flip-flop over each of them. But yeah, the Cowboys only have 2 wins, which is only, worse than the Detroit Lions, which have 0. So they've been pretty bad when they actually get to the playoffs. But they have made it 8 times, which is somewhat respectable. That's not that bad. But they only have 2 wins to show for it. So America's team, sadly, ranks number 13 on this list. All right, at number 12, we have the Arizona Cardinals, which have made it to the playoffs 5 times. They have a winning record. They're 6-5, but they've only made it 5 times to the playoffs. They do have that one Super Bowl one with Kurt Warner, ex-Ram, who went out there and played very well, added to his Hall of Fame career. Basically, that put him in the Hall of Fame because his career with the St. Louis Rams wasn't enough to get into the Hall of Fame. Taking another team to the Super Bowl actually really added to his legacy and cemented him as a Hall of Famer. So the Cardinals, they haven't been to the playoffs often. When they do, they actually do get wins, and they did make one big playoff run. So they were good for like a 2 or 3 year stretch in my lifetime that I can remember. Pretty much they've been pretty bad, but they had those 1 or 2 really good runs, and that elevates them on the list because they got 6 wins. They only been to the playoff 5 times, but they do have 6 wins to show for it. They do have 1 Super Bowl run to show for it, and that puts them at number 12 on this list. At number 12, we have actually my best friend's team, the Minnesota Vikings. They have 6 wins over the last 2 decades in the playoffs. They have 9 playoff appearances. They haven't made a Super Bowl, and even though they do have the same amount of wins as the Arizona Cardinals over the last 20 years, and the Cardinals did make a Super Bowl run, the Minnesota Vikings went to the playoffs 4 more times than them, and I kind of outweigh those 4 playoff appearances for that 1 championship run. So I had to give them a nod over the Cardinals, but it's really close. Like I said, depending on how much you value everything, is you're going to flip-flop some of these teams, so that's going to happen. But they're 6-9 and made it to the playoffs almost half of the times over the last decade, which is pretty good. One of the best, upper echelon in terms of making the playoffs. They have 6 wins to show for it, 0 Super Bowls though, and that kind of bumped them down the list because almost every other team now going forward on this list, they all have Super Bowl runs. So every team going forward has made a Super Bowl, so they're the best team not to make it to the Super Bowl, basically. So best Super Bowl, best playoff resume not to make it to the Super Bowl, in my opinion. And that puts them at number 11 on this list. At number 10, we have the San Francisco 49ers, one of our division rivals. And they've not been too good that I can remember. In my divisional, I don't really remember fearing them too much. They had like a 3 or 4 year stretch where they had a nasty defense, and they had Alex Smith, that transition between Alex Smith actually being good and then Colin Kaepernick going to a Super Bowl, going to a lot of NFC title games. So they had a pretty good run there where they were a really dominant team. It was like sandwiched in between Seahawks dominance of our division. They had a really good dominant defense, and they had good, Frank Gore running the ball, Alex Smith converting into Colin Kaepernick. They had a good couple of years right there, but other than that, they were pretty bad. They did have that Super Bowl run. They have 7 wins. They made it to the playoffs 6 times. So they have, it's very similar. Like I said, a lot of these teams are kind of bunched together. But I separate that. They have the 7 wins. They have more than any other team that's been on the list so far. And they actually do have a Super Bowl run. So that's why they stand at number 10 on this list. At number 9, we have the Carolina Panthers. Now we're getting to teams that actually have 2 Super Bowl runs right here. Carolina Panthers have actually made 2 Super Bowl runs. They have made it to the playoffs 7 times. They have 8 wins to show for it. So far, the most wins we've seen. They have a winning record at 8-7. Made it to the playoffs 7 times. 2 Super Bowl runs, one with Cam Newton and one with Jake Delhomme. They had the young Steve Smith. I remember that team. I mean, I think the year before, I think in that Super Bowl run was when we played them in the playoffs, and Jason Sehorn got his ankles broken by Steve Smith to the crib in overtime. I remember that. I broke a TV that night. Yeah, that was one of the most painful losses. Yeah, so they've been pretty good. They've had 2 separate quarterbacks taking the Super Bowls. They've been, up and down, a so-so franchise. They've had some ups and downs like almost every franchise, except for a couple of franchises, which are usually always winning. They've had their ups and downs, but 2 Super Bowl runs, you can't put it past. They have 8 playoff wins, made it to the playoffs 7 times, and that puts them at number 9 on this list. At number 8, we have the Atlanta Falcons. And again, guys, some people probably get confused. Even though they have an 8-9 record, they have more losses than the Panthers, and they have the same amount of Super Bowl runs. Obviously, more losses means you made it to the playoffs more often. That kind of elevates the value. Obviously, making the playoffs is accomplishment in the NFL. They have 2 Super Bowl runs with 2 different quarterbacks. You have the Super Bowl run they did with Chris Chandler and Jamal Anderson. I'm sorry, I have a brain fart there. Jamal Anderson, and you have the most recent one with Matt Ryan and them boys, which they should have won that Super Bowl against the Patriots. They just run the ball in the second half. I mean, they ran the ball only a few times in the second half with such a huge lead, which is ridiculous. But again, I digress. They took that L. So they had 2 different quarterbacks take them. Pretty good. They've been a pretty good team. Always there, either making the playoffs or really close to the playoffs since Matt Ryan's been there. Been a pretty steady team. 2 Super Bowl runs, they still haven't gotten over the hump and won that Super Bowl, so that kind of lands them. So I believe every team remaining on this list has actually won a Super Bowl going forward. At number 7, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They've made to the playoffs 7 times. Obviously, if you make it to the Super Bowl, you don't take an L, so they have made 7 playoff appearances. They have 4 wins. They actually have been bad before and after that little run that they had, where they had a really dominant defense with Warren Sapp, Derek Brooks, John Lynch. Like, those boys was nasty. They had Rondé Barber. It was a really good defense that they had there for like a good stretch. They were kind of overshadowed by the Ray Lewis Baltimore Ravens defense because they came right afterwards, but they were almost as good as that team defensively, and I think Brad Johnson led them to the Super Bowl. I mean, just a random guy. So, and actually traded for the coach, John Gruden, and they played the team that John Gruden came from in the Super Bowl, which is ridiculous. John Gruden got traded from the Raiders to the Bucks. That first year he was there, they won the Super Bowl against his old team, the Oakland Raiders, which is ridiculous. But again, the Buccaneers haven't been good ever since then. I mean, ever since those last couple, those like 2 or 3 year period. Well, actually, Dungy had them before then, and John Gruden. After that, they kind of fell apart, especially offensively. They were John Gruden was never able to get it going. They never had a really good quarterback, so they had their one, good stretch there. They had a really dominant defense, but they never had a really good offense to, actually get them over the hump. Only that 1 year with Brad Johnson. So that puts them at number 7 on this list. At number 6, we have the New Orleans Saints. Who they? They had that one really good. Well, they've been pretty good offensively. They've been pretty bad defensively the last couple years. They actually, until last year, they hadn't made in the playoffs in a little while. They kept going like 7-9, 6-10 around that record for like 3 or 4 years straight. But for like a 3-year period, they were just such a high-powered team. And with Drew Brees on them, they did make 1 Super Bowl win and win the Super Bowl. And actually, all their wins have been with Drew Brees. Like before Drew Brees got there, they were really bad. They only had like, I think, the win against us, I remember that. We lost to them in overtime. That was like their first playoff win since like Archie Manning time. Like it had been, or maybe the first playoff appearance since then. So they had a really bad stretch until Drew Brees got there. Then they had a really good, 3 or 4 year stretch. And then kind of like the defense got really bad over a couple of years stretch until last year where the defense kind of bounced back. So they have 8 wins over the last 2 decades. They made it to the Super Bowl. They made it to the Super Bowl and won the Super Bowl. And they've made it to the playoffs 7 times out of the last 20 years, which is pretty good. So that lands them at number 6 on the list. At number 5, we have my team, the St. Louis LA Rams, because they've been playing for the two cities over the last 2 decades. They have 6 wins. They have 2 Super Bowl runs. They made it to the playoffs 6 times, which isn't that great. But again, 2 Super Bowl runs, and let's be honest, I mean, they got cheated out of 1 Super Bowl with Spygate. I'm not holding any grudges. We should be 2-0 Super Bowls, I mean, over the last 2 decades. But we are 1-1, so we are the reason why I put us higher than the Saints, because the resumes were really close with us and the Saints, but we did make 2 Super Bowl runs, and we were a really, really dominant team for like a 3-year stretch there. I mean, then we just went completely bad, but that 3-year stretch of dominance still is in this bracket of 2 decades, so it pretty holds up, even though they've been pretty bad over like the last 10 years, even though last year we didn't make it to the playoffs. It was a stretch there where it was just some terrible football being played. Luckily, they're starting to bounce back. We got a really young, athletic defense, offense that's coming to dominate the NFL for the next couple of years. So be prepared for it. But yeah, that puts us at number 5. Again, you can bump them down with. I could flip flop them with the Saints. I was debating which one I'll go with. But I go over the 2 Super Bowl runs. We're the only we made it to the playoffs 2 times. There's going to be the Super Bowl 2 times. There's going to be teams ahead of us. They actually only made it 1 time, but they have a better overall resume than us, I believe. So now we're going to get into the heavyweights of this list. Like these are all the. Now we're going to get into like the dominant teams over the last 2 decades. These top 4 teams have dominated the NFC over the last 2 decades. At number 4, we have the Green Bay Packers. And now we're getting into the heavyweights of the NFC over the last 2 decades. And you can make arguments, any of these top 4 teams, you can make legitimate arguments for them being the top team in the playoffs over the last 2 decades. But at number 4, we have the Packers. They have the most playoff appearances. They have 14 playoff appearances, more than any NFC team. They have 12 wins. They do have a Super Bowl, but that's why I marked them down on the list, because every other team ahead of them have similar amount of wins and stuff like that. Even though they do have the most playoff appearances, they have similar amount of wins and have multiple Super Bowl runs. Packers, the only thing is they've been very consistent, making it to the playoffs a lot, but only 1 Super Bowl run out of the last 2 decades. Kind of bumped them down out of this upper echelon team. But again, there's a big separation between 4 and the rest of the teams. I think these top 4 have really separated themselves from all the NFC teams over the last 2 decades. And the Green Bay Packers land at number 4 on this list. At number 3, I have the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, going on before I did this list, just going off the top of my head before I saw any of the playoff numbers or anything like that, I thought the Eagles will be number 2, because I remember the Eagles as being very dominant early on. And they've had some playoff runs every now and then. And then they got the Super Bowl run they had this past year. So I thought they were probably going to be number 2, because I was surprised by the number 2 team. So I thought actually the Eagles were going to be number 2, because I remember the Donovan McNabb, Brian Dawkins, Deuce Staley when they had T.O. Like, I remember those teams were really great and always going to multiple NFC title games. Went to a Super Bowl where, they actually eventually lost to the Patriots. But I remember them just being really good and always at the, almost getting to the Super Bowl all those years. So I thought they were going to be the number 2 team, but they're actually number 3 team, which is pretty high. And the last year's Super Bowl really helped, because getting the Super Bowl actually allows them to get higher on this list, because they probably would have been dropped down if they didn't have any Super Bowls, because Super Bowls are weighed a lot higher. But they have been one of the dominant teams in the NFC over the last 2 decades. And they've done it with different things. And they have a bright future, because now they got Carson Wentz, even though he didn't actually win the Super Bowl for them last year. Carson Wentz is one of the best young quarterbacks, so they should have a bright future going forward. Because again, franchise quarterbacks win you get you to the playoffs, which eventually hopefully you'll cash into a few Super Bowls. But getting to the playoffs, that is the ticket into actually winning a Super Bowl, because you can't win a Super Bowl without going to the playoffs. So the Philadelphia Eagles are number 3 on my list of the top playoff resume for NFC teams over the last 2 decades. Number 2 on this list, I have the Seattle Seahawks. I honestly overlooked the Seattle Seahawks, because I kind of almost just remembered their dominant years, like over those 3 or 4 years run with Russell Wilson, Sherman, the Legion of Boom, really good defense, Marshawn Lynch running the ball. They had a really good run there, and they should have actually won 2 Super Bowls. Again, if they hand the ball off to Marshawn Lynch, we might be having a conversation as being the best team in the NFC over the last 2 decades, which is crazy for me to believe. Just hand the ball off and they will be the best team in the NFC over the last 2 decades. But since they did not win that Super Bowl, They're 1-2, and they actually did have another Super Bowl appearance. That was when they lost to the Steelers with Matt Hasselbeck. Yeah, Sean Alexander. That was a really good team. They honestly got jobbed in that Super Bowl. There was some terrible penalties called in there. They called back like a touchdown and everything. That was a very badly officiated Super Bowl. But they are 1-2. They are one of only 2 teams in the NFC to make it to 3 Super Bowls. The number 1 team actually made it to 3 Super Bowls as well. And again, they're tied for the most playoff wins. They have 12 playoff appearances. They've been a really dominant team. And one team that, off the top of my head, I didn't think of as a dominant team in the NFC. I thought, like, Packers I thought of, Eagles I thought of, and the number 1 team I didn't initially think of, but then I knew that they probably had, you know, a certain category that would propel them to the top of the list. So off the top of my head, I didn't think of the Seahawks. So they kind of caught me off guard. Even though they're in my division, I mean, I still overlooked them. So I'm pretty sure some people probably overlooked them, didn't even think of them. They have a really great playoff resume, and honestly, you can debate them as being the best team over the last 2 decades in the playoffs. And if they would have just handed the ball off to and won that Super Bowl, they would have. I think they would have been clearly the number 1 team over the last 2 decades. So now on to numero uno. Now on to number 1, the New York Football Giants, a team that I actually hate. I do live in only like 20 minutes away from the stadium, so there are a lot of Giants fans around here. Really obnoxious. They get on your nerves, yes. But you got to give props where props is due. They are 2-1 in Super Bowl. They have they actually won the 2 with they actually beat the Patriots, and then with Eli Manning, and then they had the Kerry Collins one that they got smacked by the Ravens. So they've been to the Super Bowl 3 times over the last 2 decades. They have 10 wins. They've made it to the playoffs 8 times, pretty good. But like I said, if the Seahawks would have had that 1 more Super Bowl, I would have propelled them easily over the Giants, because they have they've been to the playoffs more wins. But the Super Bowls I weigh very heavily, and they're carrying around 2 Super Bowls, which no one other team in the last 2 decades can say they have 2 Super Bowls. So that alone, they have a pretty good resume, but the 2 Super Bowls just propels them to the top, because Super Bowls are weighed highly. At the end of the day, it's all about championships. They're the only team in the NFC over the last 2 decades to have multiple championships. So with those 2 Super Bowls, that makes them number 1 on this list. If you guys enjoyed the video, if you guys disagree, maybe you want to flip-flop certain ones, let me know your list. You rank them 16 to 1 through 16, however you want to state it. You want to rank them down below, leave them down in the comments. Let me know what you guys think of the list, who you'll switch around. If you guys want me to do it with the AFC, I can do that video as well. And if you guys enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave a like down below. If you're new to the channel, please make sure to subscribe. And like I said, if any of you want to share this video with your friends, you know, start a debate amongst them as well, feel free to do so. Till next time, guys.